It's time to start the second session. So let's start now the second session in this emotional balance part of the program. And in this session, we'll be looking at how to deal with attachment and anger. In this session, we'll start with a meditation, cultivating compassion. Then we'll do a short review of some of the earlier points in the first session. Then we'll look at how to deal with attachment, then how to deal with anger. We'll do a meditation on dealing with anger. And then we'll look at a topic called cognitive fusion. And this is one of the, I think, main reasons why we react with anger, and also why we have low self-esteem and so forth. And we'll look at that, and hopefully that will also be helpful in not only helping us to deal with anger, but also to deal with things like low self-esteem and self-hatred. And then question answer at the end of the session. But let's start with the meditation, cultivating compassion. Find a nice, comfortable posture. Let's begin. As always, we begin by preparing the body. In other words, setting up a good posture, keeping the back nice and straight, and at the same time allow the entire body to become completely relaxed, completely at ease. And in this way, setting the body into a state of relaxation, stillness, and vigilance. Allowing the breathing to settle into its natural rhythm. Simply allowing it to flow naturally and effortlessly. And preparing the mind, setting it into a state of ease and relaxation. Simply allowing it to come to rest in the present moment. Resting in that stillness. Compassion is the wish or aspiration for ourselves and others to be free of suffering and its causes. And again, we can begin by cultivating compassion for ourselves and then expanding out to others. And as before, we can begin by imagining the inner purity of your mind, a level of the mind that is untouched by any mental afflictions, to imagine this inner purity of your mind in the form of a small, white, radiant sphere of light at the center of your chest and at the level of your heart. And then arouse the thought, how wonderful it would be if I were free of suffering and its causes. May I be free of all suffering and its causes. May I be free of all mental afflictions. And imagining your mental afflictions and suffering in the form of black smoke filling your body. And then with each in-breath, imagine drawing that black smoke into the sphere of light at your heart, completely dissolving it there. So with each in-breath, breathe in with compassion, dissolving and extinguishing your mental afflictions and suffering at your heart. Dissolving it into the inner purity of your mind, into your inner wisdom. And then imagine the black cloud is now completely extinguished. And now you're completely free of all mental afflictions and suffering. And simply rest in that freedom, rest in that purity of mind. And just as you wish to be free of suffering, so does everyone else. And so next bring to mind someone close to you, a loved one, who's currently experiencing some sort of physical or mental problem or suffering. And imagine them very clearly in front of you. And arouse the thought, how wonderful it would be if they were free of that problem, free of that suffering. May you be free of all suffering and its causes. And then imagine their problem or suffering in the form of black smoke filling their body. And with each in-breath, imagine drawing that smoke out of their body and bringing it into the sphere of light at your heart, completely dissolving it there. And so with each in-breath, breathe in with compassion, dissolving and extinguishing their suffering at your heart. And then imagine the black cloud is now completely extinguished. And now they're completely free of that problem, free of that suffering. And take delight in this. And next, bring to mind someone who you know well, but is neither a friend nor someone who you dislike. And again, picture them very clearly in front of you. They're just like yourself in wanting to be free of suffering. And so arouse the thought, how wonderful it would be if they were free of suffering and its causes. May you be free of all suffering and its causes. May you be free of all mental afflictions. Imagining their mental afflictions and suffering in the form of black smoke filling their body. And with each in-breath, breathe in with compassion, dissolving and extinguishing their mental afflictions and suffering at your heart. Imagine now the black cloud is completely extinguished, and now they're completely free of all mental afflictions and suffering. And take joy in this. Next, bring to mind a difficult person, someone who you dislike. Again, imagining them very clearly in front of you. They are also just like yourself in wanting to be free of suffering. And so arouse the thought, how wonderful it would be if they are free of suffering and its causes. May you be free of all suffering and its causes. May you be free of all mental afflictions. Imagining their mental afflictions and suffering in the form of black smoke filling their body. And with each in-breath, imagine drawing that black smoke out of their body and bringing it into the sphere of light at your heart, completely dissolving it there. And so with each in-breath, breathe in with compassion, dissolving and extinguishing their mental afflictions and suffering at your heart. And then imagine the black cloud is now completely extinguished. And now they're completely free of all mental afflictions and suffering. And take joy in this. And then release all appearances and allow the mind to come to rest. To rest in that inner purity of mind. Which is in the nature of compassion. And we can bring the meditation to a close. Let's start with a short review. So today we're looking at the fourth of the four types of mental balance, that is emotional balance, or in the article they call it cognitive balance. Emotional balance, here in the article it says that entails a freedom from excessive emotional vacillation, emotional apathy, and inappropriate emotions. I'm sorry, in the article it calls, this is called affective balance. Cognitive balance is motivational balance. And the three types of imbalance, again here, deficit is where we have this emotional deadness or indifference. Hyperactivity is where we're completely oscillating between elation, depression, hope, fear, infatuation, aversion, and so forth. And then dysfunction is when we are reacting inappropriately to a situation, particularly reacting with attachment, aversion, jealousy, and so forth. And we achieve balance when we're aware of our own and others' emotions, triggers, and behaviors as they arise. So again, attentional balance training is important for us to be able to do that. And then making wise choices, cognitive balance, while engaging with emotional experience. And we saw here in the article, they talk about two aspects of emotional balance. One is to, in Buddhism, to engage in these four practices called the four Immeasurables, cultivating these four qualities of loving kindness, compassion, empathetic joy, equanimity. And the other area of emotional balance is very specific methods for working and dealing with mental afflictions, like craving, hostility, delusion, arrogance, and envy. And here in particular, this session will be looking at the mental afflictions of attachment and anger, two of the most dominant mental afflictions that we have. And so let's go to looking at those directly. First, we'll look at attachment. We'll look at what it is, where it comes from, and then how to deal with it. Attachment in Sanskrit is raga, in Pali lobha, and attachment is a mental affliction. And a mental affliction in Sanskrit, the word is klesha. And a klesha is defined as a mental factor which cause the mind to become agitated or disturbed. Sometimes this word klesha is translated as afflictive emotions, disturbing emotions, and delusions, and so forth. But I think it's a little bit misleading to call them afflictive emotions or disturbing emotions, because actually most or many kleshas are not emotions. In fact, in Buddhism, we don't really talk about emotions, because actually in Sanskrit and Tibetan, there is no word that means emotion. And so in Buddhist psychology, it's more about directing at the underlying intention rather than the surface emotion. that we really need to address the underlying intention. And that's where we talk about mental afflictions, that it's really the underlying intentions, as we're going to see with mental afflictions, that if we understand what they are and we correct them, then we can overcome mental afflictions. Now, when mental afflictions in Buddhist psychology are presented in an extensive way, we have a list of 26. We condense those down to the 6 root mental afflictions, or we can condense all of those down to the 3 poisons, which we saw earlier: ignorance, attachment, and aversion. Ignorance here is a distorted view of reality, that we overinflate reality. We're grasping onto things which are dependent as independent. And from that, we end up with attachment to pleasant things, aversion to unpleasant things, and then the whole mess starts from there. So that's why we're focusing on these 2 dynamics of attachment for pleasant, aversion for unpleasant. With the aversion, we're going to focus on a specific type of aversion, anger, very destructive. First, though, let's look at attachment. And attachment is defined as a mental factor that sees its object as attractive. It exaggerates the object's attractiveness and thus wishes to possess and hold the object. Why? Because attachment believes that object is a source of our happiness. And so attachment comes from our distorted view of reality. The distorted view of reality which grasps onto an independent objective world. And from that distorted view, when we see something, experience something pleasant, it seems like that thing there is the cause of my happiness. And so therefore we want that thing. So that's why we end up with attachment. Now, attachment being a mental affliction, we're to fully eliminate it. But then when people hear that we are to fully eliminate attachment, then sometimes confusion happens. One is like, does that mean we need to eliminate all of our desires and passions, that somehow we wouldn't have any drive in our life anymore? And so here we need to be careful on terminology. This word desire and passion can really have at least 2 different meanings. Sometimes the word desire is synonymous with attachment, just wanting to grab and hold onto something. And sometimes the word desire is used in terms of aspiration, to aspire for something worthwhile. So that type of desire, where we are aspiring to some worthwhile goal, we need to increase. Desire meaning craving, attachment, we need to get rid of. Similarly with passion. Passion, if in terms of an aspiration for a worthwhile goal, those sorts of passions we need to increase. Passion in terms of craving and attachment, we need to get rid of, because it just creates suffering. First, before we look at how to deal with attachment, just to clarify some doubts or confusion about attachment, or some misconceptions about attachment. One is that often people feel like, if I get rid of attachment, my life will become very bland and boring because I need attachment to enjoy things. That's often the misconception. But actually, attachment interferes with our enjoyment of the simple pleasures in life. And we know this well, particularly when we have strong craving and attachment for something. Then often with that comes fear and worry about not getting it, not getting enough of it, losing it, frustration when we don't get it, overindulging when we do get it, a lot of dissatisfaction and disappointment when it doesn't live up to our expectation, and just more and more craving because it never really fully satisfies us. And we end up losing enjoyment of the things we used to like if we have craving and attachment, because we know well that if there's something we enjoy, but we get it too often, after a few times of getting that thing, craving and attachment goes, sorry, that's not good enough anymore. I need something bigger, better, and different. We're never satisfied. And so we need to let go of attachment. But what we need to understand here is that letting go of attachment doesn't mean we become detached to things. That's also an extreme. The 2 extremes we get caught up in is attachment and detachment, because when things overwhelm us, we detach from them. We step back and avoid them because they give us so much suffering. They are the 2 extremes. Both attachment and detachment come from a distorted view of reality. that the source of happiness and suffering is out there. There's an independent, objective world there. And so the middle way of letting go of attachment is non-attachment, meaning fully engaging in our experience without attachment. And this really comes from a correct view of reality. And so hence we see here, as part of dealing with attachment, the cognitive balance is essential. Because as long as we believe that the source of my happiness is out there, then the natural consequence is attachment. We will not be able to effectively deal with attachment as long as we have that cognitive imbalance. We need to work on that cognitive imbalance. We need to really come to see that the source of happiness is not out there, it lies within our own mind. So another example of how an integrated approach is essential, is very effective. But then also people have another doubt. They think, well, actually, I need attachment for a relationship. Without attachment, there would be no basis for a relationship. Now, part of the confusion here is terminology and how the word attachment is used. And I think there's a difference here between Buddhism and psychology, Western psychology. In fact, in psychology, we often hear about attachment theory, that there are actually healthy forms of attachment we need to actively cultivate. For example, a strong bond between mother and child is a classic example. So again, here, I think we need to understand the difference of how the word attachment is used, is that in Buddhism, again, we're talking about intention, that it's this intention to want something, to hold on to it because we think it's the source of our happiness. Here in psychology, attachment is defined as a deep and emotional, well, this is one in definition I found, whereas attachment is a deep and enduring emotional bond that connects one person to another across time and space. Nothing wrong with that, according to Buddhism. We need to have a strong bond between ourselves and everyone else. So we need to increase that. Whereas attachment is actually, it's all about me, seeing that person as a source of my happiness. That we need to get rid of. And so therefore, there are two dynamics in all the relationships that we have. A healthy one of loving kindness, the unhealthy one of attachment. And they're usually mixed together. So we are to distinguish these two dynamics, increase loving kindness, decrease attachment, relationships will improve. Now, the love or loving kindness is simply the wish for them to be happy. The fine print is without expecting anything in return, what we would call unconditional love, no strings attached love. Conditional love or strings attached love is love polluted by attachment. And that sounds like this: I will love you, and here comes the condition, as long as you keep saying and doing things that make me happy. Otherwise, no. So that's all attachment speaking. So attachment's all about me, 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 and actually sees the other person as an object, a thing to satisfy me. So not very nice. So the easy way to distinguish the two, love is saying, I want you to be happy. Attachment is saying, I want you to make me happy. So therefore, if we can reduce attachment as much as possible, increase loving kindness as much as possible, our relationships will improve. But then also when it comes to being creative, people often mistakenly think that, well, I need attachment to be creative. But no one's doubting the fact that mental afflictions like craving, attachment, jealousy, anger, and hatred provide a lot of material for creativity. But we're talking here about the source of creativity. And the source of creativity is not the mental afflictions. It comes from deep within our own mind. And as long as our mind is agitated and suffocated by mental afflictions like craving and attachment, it suffocates our creativity. So by eliminating craving, attachment, other mental afflictions, creativity can come more through, and we'll become more creative, and we'll become more creative for a more meaningful motivation rather than with attachment. It's all about me and how wonderful I am in terms of my creativity. And therefore, in summary, if we reduce and eliminate attachment, we'll enjoy the simple pleasures in life much more, our relationships will improve, and our creativity will increase. So it's a win-win-win situation. Now, how to deal with attachment. First step, to have a clear understanding of attachment, as we've just started to describe here previously, to understand what it is and how it just leads to suffering, and therefore have a wish to be free of it. Because as long as we feel like attachment is something useful, that's bringing us happiness, of course, we're not going to be able to get rid of it, because we'll want it, because we'll think it's something useful. The second step is cultivating a view of genuine happiness. Again, coming from that motivational balance, the preliminaries, to really come to see that the source of happiness is within our own mind, not out there. If we don't do this, if we don't do motivational balance, these preliminary practices, we'll continue to feel like the source of happiness is out there, which means that as soon as we see something pleasant, attachment will follow. There's no way we're going to be able to effectively deal with attachment. Then, having done that, then we'll have really a basis for actually dealing with attachment. If we have an aspiration to be free of it and understand that source of happiness comes within our own mind, then what we can do is, as attachments are rising, just observe it. For this, we need mindfulness, we need shamatha, we need the attentional balance to be able to do this. If we can observe it when it's arising, we're not identifying with it, we're free of it. It can't go anywhere, it can't harm us, we're not feeding it. It will simply dissipate. We don't need to fight with it. So this is very helpful, effective way of dealing with attachment. But for this to work, we need attentional balance training. We need shamatha practice. In addition to this, we can apply what's called antidotes to overcome the attachment. And often this comes within the vipassana, the cognitive balance side of things. For example, by seeing the things we're attached to as impermanent, changing moment by moment, nothing to grab hold of, that attachment will dissipate. If we go even further and see the emptiness, where is the beauty in that object that really seems to be there? To come to realize beauty is in the eye of the beholder, that will also dissipate the attachment. So again, applying antidotes here to attachment is very important to engage in the cognitive balance, the vipassana practice. And so then if we use these methods of dealing with attachment, we learn how to do this in meditation, we can apply them in daily life. That's attachment. Let's now briefly look at anger before we go to a meditation on how to deal with anger. Anger in Sanskrit is pratiga, in Pali pattiga. Like attachment, anger is a mental affliction. Agitates and disturbs the mind. Anger is defined as a mental factor that sees its object as unattractive. It exaggerates the object's unattractiveness and thus wishes to harm the object. Why? Because anger believes that object is a source of our suffering. Where does anger come from? Again, like attachment, it comes from our distorted view of reality, grasping onto independent me, independent objective world, which means that when we encounter something unpleasant out there, that unpleasant thing seems to be the source of our suffering. And then we wish to harm that thing or person that is really seems to be the source of our suffering. Like attachment, anger is to be fully eliminated. And here again, part of confusion is terminology and how the word anger is used. What we see here is in the way that anger is used, the word anger is used in Buddhism, is the intention to harm. Whereas I think in psychology, a little bit different how the word anger is defined. In fact, this is very much highlighted to me recently. I read a book from a well-known psychologist who basically said, you Buddhists have got it completely wrong. It's not about getting rid of anger. It's about having the right type of anger in the right time, in the right amount. He said, otherwise, how would you deal with difficult things like social injustice? So it became very clear to me he didn't really understand how the word anger was used in Buddhism, is that built in the word is intention to harm. That's never okay. But I think what he's including in psychology in the word anger is using very strong, forceful words and actions. That's okay for Buddhism. What is key is what is driving that. If what is driving strong, forceful words and actions, compassion, good. If what's driving it is intention to harm or hurt, not good. That's anger. We need to get rid of that. So again, it's really the underlying intention that we're focusing on here, not the verbal and physical display, not the emotional display. And a couple of misconceptions from anger, and then we'll look at how to deal with anger. Now, generally, we understand anger is very harmful and we want to get rid of it. But then sometimes there's still a doubt, or is that, well, but sometimes actually anger is useful because it helps me to deal with difficult situations. Now, no one's denying that anger is very forceful. But what we've seen from the definition of anger, and we know from our own experience, is that anger exaggerates and distorts. It doesn't see things clearly. We know that well from our own experience. When we're caught up in very strong anger, we tend to exaggerate and distort what we apprehend, and we tend to react in a wrong way or overreact and don't actually resolve the problem. It just gets worse. And so, therefore, we don't need anger in difficult situations. In fact, Buddhism would recommend, instead of getting angry, we practice patience. But when that is said, then people get often another wrong idea. And then they think, well, okay, according to Buddhism, then in these difficult situations, what I should do is sit there and do nothing. Isn't that patience? No, that's not patience, at least how it's defined in Buddhism. Patience is an undisturbed mind in the face of a difficult situation. So when Buddhism is recommended we practice patience, it's not a behavior, it's a mental attitude. What Buddhism is saying is that when you're faced with a difficult situation, remain calm. Because if we can remain calm, we can a better chance of more clearly and accurately evaluating what's going on here. And then we have a better chance of a better response, a more accurate response. But then there are certain circumstances where, in very difficult situations, we may need to use force to respond. But how can I do that if I can't use anger? The Buddhist answer is compassion. But then when that's said, then often people, again, have a mistaken idea, thinking that, well, actually, compassion is a sign of weakness and anger is a sign of strength. Because often people mistakenly think that compassion means, smile and say nice things to people. That's not compassion. Compassion is, again, intention. It's the aspiration, wish, intention to help that person to overcome their negative behavior if they're causing suffering. And so if we sit there, allow them to, for example, beat us up, that's not compassion. That's the opposite of compassion. So therefore, with compassion, we can be very forceful. And anger is actually a sign of weakness because it means that we can't deal with difficult situations without trying to dominate others. That's a sign of weakness. Compassion is a sign of strength. So compassion can be very forceful when necessary, because compassion is all about helping that person to overcome their negative behavior and the suffering that they are causing as a result of that. How do we deal with anger then? Very similar approach with compassion. First, to have a clear understanding of anger, to understand what it is and how it only leads to suffering, that anger is never okay. Because anger here, again, is the way it's used here is the intention to harm. So again, if we, in difficult situations, if we're using very strong language and behavior based on an intention to help them, that's not anger. That's actually compassion. So anger is intention to harm. So that, to understand that and how it only leads to suffering, to develop the aspiration to be free of it, to deal with anger. But again, the second step, cultivate this view of genuine happiness. Because if we don't do that, if we have this worldview that the source of my suffering is coming from out there, then of course, when we see something unpleasant, then aversion, hostility, anger, and hatred will naturally follow. Whereas if we've shifted our worldview, we see the source of suffering is coming from within, then we can start to effectively deal with anger. How to do that? First step, mindfulness. To notice anger when it's first arising. Because now we don't tend to have very good mindfulness, and we only notice anger when it's already taken control of our mind. then it's a little bit late because our mind is already out of control. And then about the only thing we can do at that point is get out of that situation fast before we say and do things that we're going to regret. So the key is to catch anger before it takes control of our mind. So we have this little window of opportunity from when first anger starts to arise until the point it takes control of our mind. It may only be a second or two, but with mindfulness, through the attentional balance training, we can gain access to that window of opportunity. And all we need to do is, like attachment, just observe it. Because if we can observe the anger as it's arising, we're free of it. It can't do anything to us. It can't harm us. It will simply dissipate. We don't need to fight with anger. Fighting with anger is like throwing petrol on the fire. It just gets worse. So all we need to do is step back and watch the anger. Very effective way of dealing with anger, like attachment, like all other mental afflictions. And in addition to just observing it, again, we can apply antidotes. And often these antidotes also come from the Vipassana side of the practice. First one is patience, to simply be present, undisturbed mind in the face of a difficult situation. And then, like attachment, we can either go to the impermanence to see everything's changing moment by moment, so there's nothing to push against, or at a deeper level, through the emptiness, to really see that, like attachment, where we saw that beauty is in the eye of the beholder, there's no beauty objectively there, there's no ugliness here objectively there, we're creating it. And so therefore that anger will dissipate. And so these are some antidotes we can apply to anger. And so again, if we become familiar with these processes in meditation, then we can start to apply them in daily life and to really effectively deal with anger. And so that's what we're going to do now. We're going to go through some of these points to become familiar with them in meditation so that later we can apply them in daily life. So let's do that meditation of some ways of dealing with anger. Find a nice, comfortable posture. Let's begin. Setting the body into a state of relaxation, stillness, and vigilance. And relaxing more deeply with each out-breath. Allowing the breathing to flow naturally and effortlessly. And allowing the mind to come to rest in the stillness of the present moment. Allowing the mind to remain relaxed, still, and clear. Anger is a mental factor that sees its object as unattractive it exaggerates the object's unattractiveness and thus wishes to harm the object. Why? Because it believes that object is the source of our suffering. So let's have a look at some ways of dealing with anger. So first, think of a situation where you got angry or frustrated when something didn't work out the way you wanted it to. And then ask yourself, could I have done something about that situation? If we can do something to change a situation, then there's no need to get angry. We just make the change. And if there's nothing we can do to change a situation, then what's the use in getting angry? It doesn't help. Next, think of a situation where you got angry when someone else criticized you. Try to picture the scene clearly. And then ask yourself, was their criticism valid? If what they said was true, why get angry? Because they're giving us the chance to correct our faults and to improve ourselves. And if what they said was untrue, then since they're completely mistaken, then we can simply ignore what they're saying. And regardless of whether their criticism was valid or not, they're providing us the opportunity to develop the quality of patience. So in fact, they're being very kind to us in this way. Next, think of a situation where you got angry in a conflict with another person. And again, try to picture the scene very clearly. And now, instead of looking at the situation from your own perspective, assume the perspective of the other person and try to imagine how the situation would look to them. And when we try to understand their viewpoint, we can see that they're just like us. They're just trying to be happy, and that due to their confusion and mental afflictions, they're just creating suffering for themselves and those around them. And so in this way, by distinguishing the person from their behavior, we can begin to develop compassion for them. And if their behavior is inappropriate, we can address their bad behavior without attacking the person. Next, think of a situation where you often get irritated or frustrated. and allow some irritation or frustration to arise. And now, instead of focusing on the situation, look directly at the irritation or frustration itself. Don't try to push it away. Just look at it directly. What is the nature of the irritation or frustration? Is it something solid and concrete, or does it change over time? And if we look directly at the irritation or frustration in this way, does it have any power over us? Do we need to fight with it? Or does it simply start to dissolve? And next, think of a person who often makes you angry or irritated. And picture them very clearly in front of you. And then mentally dissect that person and try to pinpoint precisely what exactly is it that makes you angry or irritated. Is it something that they say that makes you irritated? If so, words are just sounds. So which sound is irritating or makes you angry? Or perhaps it's something that they do that makes you angry or irritated. Actions are just movements of the body. So which movement makes you angry or irritated? Or perhaps it's simply their appearance that makes you angry or irritated. Appearances are just collections of colors and shapes. So which particular color or shape is irritating? And when we investigate in this way, we can see how it is our mind that creates the irritating, annoying person by interpreting the situation in a certain way and then applying labels such as annoying or irritating. But then we go on to mistake our concept of the person for the person themselves. We see them as inherently irritating from their own side. And so, in conclusion, recognize that by engaging in these sorts of reflections repeatedly, relating them to situations in our life, we can clear up a lot of anger and frustration. And we can develop a more healthy way of looking at things and make a strong determination to do so. we can bring the meditation to a close. Why do we get angry with others who behave badly? And why is it so difficult to have compassion for them? I think there's a simple answer to that. If someone is engaging in a harmful behavior, the correct perspective is simply acknowledging there is a person doing or engaging in a bad or harmful action. That's the correct perspective. But often we adopt a different perspective. And if someone's behaving in a bad way, our perspective is there's a bad person, horrible person, nasty person, evil person. And so what we've done there is we have fused the person and the behavior together and made them one thing. This is called cognitive fusion. And this is a false, invalid perspective, because there are two things here. There's a person and the behavior. But if we fuse them together, make them one thing, we have that view. There's a bad person. And if we do this cognitive fusion, we're in trouble, because in any given situation, we've got two choices: accept or reject. And generally, if someone's behaving badly, we reject. But reject on the basis of cognitive fusion means we end up attacking the person. Because the thing we don't like actually is their bad behavior. But because we've fused the behavior to the person, we end up directing our rejection to the person themselves. We attack the person, we get angry at the person. But if we understand that attacking the person, getting angry at the person is not helpful, then the only other option left is accept. But if we accept on the basis of cognitive fusion, accept translates into accepting their bad behavior, which is also not okay. But they're the two choices we've got if we do cognitive fusion: reject the person, attack the person, or accept their bad behavior. Both of those are not helpful. And then compassion becomes very difficult on the basis of cognitive fusion, because having compassion for a bad person feels like what we're saying is, oh, what you did is okay, I don't mind that. Of course we should mind. That's why we often feel like that they don't deserve compassion, they don't deserve forgiveness, because they're just such a bad, horrible person. And then it's even worse than that, because we end up then with a fixed, biased view of that person. They're a bad person. And then it becomes difficult to acknowledge anything good they do, because bad people don't do good things. And so if they do some good behavior, we'll sort of brush it off and say, well, they didn't really mean to do that because they're just such a bad person. And then it also leads to conflict, because, you know, they're the bad person, I'm the good person, they're the bad guys over there, we're the good guys over here, let's get rid of those bad guys over there. So we end up with a lot of conflict. And then we end up judging the person. Judging is based on cognitive fusion. And so what's the solution to all of this? Simply don't do cognitive fusion, because cognitive fusion is a false, invalid perspective. There are two things here. There's a person and their behavior. So the answer is simply adopt the correct perspective and acknowledge there is a person engaging in a harmful behavior. Then we can accept the person, i.e. have forgiveness and compassion for the person, and at the same time reject their negative behavior, not tolerate that negative behavior, help them to address that negative behavior. So therefore, forgiveness and compassion becomes more easy. We end up with a balanced view of that person, because like us, everyone sometimes does good things, sometimes does bad things. And then we don't get into us versus them, good guys versus bad guys. We're all people wanting to be happy, wanting to be free of suffering. We all sometimes do good things, sometimes do bad things. And so therefore, rather than conflict, we end up with cooperation, trying to help others who engage in harmful behavior, instead of judging them and attacking them and so forth. And instead of judging the person, we evaluate behavior. We must evaluate behavior. You know, sometimes we hear in the modern world, we are to be non-judgmental, which is good. But unfortunately, if we're doing cognitive fusion, non-judgmental, but on the basis of cognitive fusion, sort of translates into accepting everything, ethical disaster. So being non-judgmental doesn't mean accept everything. Non-judgmental really means don't do cognitive fusion. Adopt the correct perspective, and the correct perspective means evaluate behavior. We must evaluate our own and others' behavior and then try to overcome our own negative behavior as best we can and help others to overcome their negative behavior. So if we're criticizing people, blaming people, judging people, this is on the basis of cognitive fusion. The only thing that's going to come out of that is we're going to get angry at them, we're going to attack them, we're going to hate them, and then it's just going to be a big mess. Rather, if we don't do cognitive fusion, then what comes out of that is forgiveness, compassion, but at the same time, not tolerating any negative behavior and helping that person to overcome that negative behavior. And then if that person is really physically attacking us, then with compassion, we can use force if necessary to restrain that person. And so therefore, cognitive fusion will probably lead to anger, judging, blaming, criticizing. A correct perspective will lead to compassion, helping, cooperating, and trying to overcome that negative behavior. And what we'll do in the next session is we'll take that one step further and we'll apply this to ourselves. And a question already came up about this being self-critical, self-judging, and so forth. And so the same thing will apply there, but we'll look at that in terms of being self-judging, low self-esteem, self-hatred, and so forth in the next session. So we'll leave it there now. And we've got time for 10 minutes of questions. So any questions, again, put them in the chat and I'll try to answer them as best as I can. So do we have any questions? Maybe any from leftover from last session or from this session?
Yes, so we have some questions from the break and also from during this class.
Sure.
So Benny and Dorit are asking, according to Buddhism, we have so many practices that it takes many years to develop each one of the practices. How can we make a shortcut to overcome the suffering while being engaged in the studying and practicing those major subjects?
Well, actually, what I've sort of mentioned a bit, and we'll talk about more in the third session today, is the shortcut is actually an integrated approach. That if we spend a long time working on preliminaries and that's all we do, and then after that we spend a long time doing shamatha stuff and that's all we do, and then after that we spend a long time doing vipassana and then a long time doing compassion, then we're probably not going to get very far and we're going to do a lot of suffering. Whereas if we, from the very beginning, we touch on each of those 4 areas, they will all start to work together. And so we can, in the beginning, what we've seen though is first we need to sort out our motivational balance. That what I would recommend is that initially work on the view of genuine happiness. Because if we don't get that sort of a little bit sorted, then we're just going to keep reacting, because we're still going to hold on to the fact that the source of my suffering is out there, source of my happiness is out there. And that's just going to drive us into attachment to pleasant, aversion, anger, hatred, jealousy, craving. That's the natural consequence. Whereas if we can really start to appreciate that the source of happiness and suffering lies within and not out there, that's a good start. That's already going to help us to work with not reacting, thereby creating more suffering. And then the second thing, and we've seen that, is the attentional balance. So part of the shortcut then would be on the basis of really cultivating that view of genuine happiness is develop mindfulness through attentional balance training. that through doing any one of the shamatha practices of focusing on the breath, the mind, resting and awareness, whatever the object, if we can start to improve our mindfulness, then a way to overcome a lot of suffering is to, when things are arising, not to react, simply observe whatever's coming up. And we'll look at that. And that comes a little bit more also, is that we saw that in dealing with anger and attachment, is that, you know, we first, on the basis of understanding what they are, we first really cultivate that view of genuine happiness to start to work with that. Then we can start to develop some mindfulness through shamatha practice. Then we've really got a starting point for being able to observe without reacting, without creating more suffering. But then if we really want to start to go further, then we need to start to pull in a little bit of compassion. And with that, what I would really recommend to, if you want to cut it down to sort of the core, is what we're going to do in the next session, this Tonglen practice. That is a very key element of compassion. So if we do that one compassion practice, effective. And then what I'd recommend is pulling in from the wisdom, the Vipassana side, is impermanence. Just seeing things as being transitory. If we can just do those four little things, well, they're not little actually, but we simplify all of the various practices that you mentioned, and there are many of them, down to those four: view of genuine happiness, mindfulness, Tonglen, and impermanence. We start there. Those four key elements, I think we can really start the shortcut, so to speak, and start to really effectively change our life around, less mental afflictions, less suffering. And then on that basis, then we can start to expand out in the wisdom with more emptiness stuff, and the compassion, we can go into more exchanging self with others and so forth and so on. So we can branch out from there. But if we cover those four elements in a very simple way, that will provide a very integrated approach to start to really reduce our suffering in our life and improve our life. Next question.
All right, so C is asking, I have a tendency for emotional imbalance, hyper, and I experience depression and anxiety at times. At these times, I find it almost impossible to meditate or practice. It is extremely difficult for me to stay focused, or it is just too painful being in touch with the experience. What do you recommend to do in times like this?
Yeah, very good question, and very common. And again, what we've seen here in these four types of mental balance is, and we'll look at that again more in the next session, is that both the cognitive and emotional balance are definitely preceded by attentional balance. Because again, unless we can pick up these things like anxiety, depression, and so forth, when they're first arising, if we don't notice them until they've really got control of our mind and we're completely anxious and completely depressed, then it's very difficult to deal with these. But if we can see them when they're first arising and just observe them, that can help. Maybe they won't go away, but at least we won't get caught up in them so much, and they won't get bigger and bigger and bigger. I mean, they may still be there, but you probably find they're a little bit more manageable. And what you can do is, if you're trying to observe that anxiety or depression, but it's starting to really grab your mind, then what you can do, again, based on mindfulness, so having some attentional balance training, is shift your focus from the depression, anxiety, whatever's coming up in the mind, shift it into the body and just observe what's happening in the body at that time, because due to that anxiety or depression, just notice that what's going on in the body, because that body is a non-conceptual space, and it's easier to observe. A little bit more difficult to observe directly the anxiety, depression, because we're caught up in the conceptual mind. Much easier to get caught up in it and get pulled away by it. So if you can catch it, try and catch it early and just watch it. And don't go, oh no, not that anxiety, go away, depression, oh, go away, go away. Just observe it, because the more you can observe it, the more free you are of it, the less it will develop and go to a bigger level. And again, if it starts to do that, shift into the body and just observe what's happening in the body. If that's not even working, the backup strategy to that would be to shift your focus, meaning, because often these things also develop because we're too much obsessively focused on ourselves. Poor me, I'm getting caught up in anxiety, depression. No. And so then if that's not working, then what I recommend is to get out, you know, and interact with other people and to focus on others. And that's going to be also very helpful. A lot more to be said on that, but I think we can leave it there for that. Next question. We've got time for one or two more questions.
We have a question about the psychology book that you referred to. What is the name of that?
Oof, I'd have to.
Yeah,
it was some years ago now. It was quite a well-known psychologist, and I was recommended the book, and no, it's gone. I can't remember. Sorry, I can't remember the name. But if I remember the name, I'll make it available. But it was really striking. You know, it's not like Buddhism's right or psychology's right and wrong. It's not right and wrong. What really came clear to me is that he and Buddhism, that they were using the same word in two different ways, not exactly the same. And so, you know, he was sort of saying, you know, Buddhism's got it wrong, we've got it right. But from what I understood was, well, he's got it right and Buddhism's got it right. It's just that we're talking about two different things, you know. And so I think that's part of the difficulty, is that a lot of these terms in Buddhism that come from, they're all coming from Sanskrit and Pali. There really is no word, there is no word in English that has the same meaning. So the translator's forced to pick a word that sort of approximates it, but then it can create a lot of confusion, like in this case here. And again, with Buddhist psychology, the emphasis is really on the sort of level of intention. And again, there's no word in Sanskrit or in Tibetan that means emotion. So we're not really talking about here, in terms of mental afflictions, we're not talking really about the emotional displays, the verbal and physical displays, but what is driving that. That's where we're really addressing it, because that's what we need to resolve. If we can fix up the intention, then the manifestation of that in terms of verbal and physical display will take care of itself. Okay, I think we've got time for one more question and then we'll take a break, if there is another question.
There are about 3, so...
Okay, well, if they're short, we can try and address 2 at least.
So more of a comment, less of a question.
Sure.
Anat is saying, regarding the anger as intention to harm, when I get angry with my child and react inappropriately, I don't intend to harm her, but I do. So basically saying there's no intention to harm.
Right, yeah. See here, that's the thing, is that we don't want to harm, but anger has that intention. So what's happened is, even though we don't want to harm, anger has taken control of our mind, and it's driving us to say and do things that we're going to regret. And we do regret it, because we as a person never want to intend to harm our children. And that's why anger is so destructive, is that anger takes control of our mind, and we end up saying and doing things that we regret. So yes, that's a good point. So we as a person, we don't want to harm anyone. Well, certainly not our children, but anger is a distorted state of mind that is taking control of our mind. And that is what's driving our behavior. That's why we regret those things we say and do when we harm people, exactly for that reason, because our rational self doesn't want to harm children. But anger is based on a distorted view of reality. And in the moment, anger actually doesn't see that person as our child. That anger just sees the person as an object that is causing me suffering. And so I need to get rid of it. And that's the tragedy with anger, is it's really destructive. Maybe one more question we can do, and then we'll take a break.
All right. So how we can act towards non-justice phenomena with compassion, violence, for example?
Yeah, with compassion. Yeah. So again, it's based on the view of happiness and suffering coming within. And if someone is engaging in some very harmful way, we can see that, again, like, for example, if we had a child who had a mental illness, which meant that child was physically attacking us all the time, do we get angry at the child? Do we try and harm the child? No, because we see that the child is dominated by that mental illness. Similarly, everyone who's behaving badly is dominated by a mental illness of anger or whatever. And so therefore, to see that, and that's why if we avoid the cognitive fusion, and instead of seeing them as a bad person, we see them as a person like us. They just want to be happy, want to be free of suffering, but because of that mental affliction of anger or whatever it is that's dominating their mind, that's driving them to behave in that way. So let's help that person to overcome that mental affliction, just like we'd like to help the child to overcome the mental illness. And that is compassion. And compassion can be very strong, to really be very forceful if necessary to help that person to overcome that negative behavior. But if we do that cognitive fusion and we see that person as a bad, evil person, we won't be able to do that because we'll feel like they don't deserve it. We need to punish them because they're such a bad person. But technically speaking, there is no such thing as a bad person. There are only people who sometimes engage in bad behavior, and sometimes very, very bad behavior. And if we can see that correct perspective, then you'll find it's much more easy to have compassion for that person. And at the same time, we can be very forceful in stopping that person from engaging in that harmful behavior, because we're trying to help that person to overcome that mental affliction and all the suffering that they are producing in that way. So, and we'll talk a little bit more about that next session. But let's break now, have a short break, and we'll come back in the last session, and I want to look at the integrated approach. But before that, I want to address this idea of low self-esteem and how to overcome low self-esteem and self-hatred. And then we'll look at how we can integrate all of these 4 elements of mental balance in a cohesive way, to really strive for that mental balance and well-being. But first, let's take a break. We'll see you back in about 25 minutes at 12 o'clock.